Let me begin by saying my familiarity with James Bond is very limited. I've only really seen 3 James Bond films, including this one, throughout my entire life, all the way through. I mean, I've seen bits and pieces of other Bond films whenever they aired them on TV, and I've only played one of the James Bond games, and it wasn't even GoldenEye, it was Agent Under Fire, which isn't that good, at least in my opinion, so I'm not the best judge of how things stack up against other films in the franchise, especially since my first James Bond movie was The World Is Not Enough, so all I can say is I'm kind of flying into this completely blind here. With that said, let's get started with this episode of Romney's Reviews. Now, the first thing I noticed is that the story gets really dense really quickly. And it's not just a case of where it's overwhelming like The Dark Knight Rises, for example, but it's really a case of where it's not just a simple good versus evil, spy versus spy sort of story. There's a lot of emotional subtext attached to it, and there's just a lot more layers to it, and it also kind of analyzes the relevance of the Bond franchise as a whole. Keep in mind, the original stories that Ian Fleming wrote, as well as the earlier movies, were released during the Cold War, back when the Soviet Union was trying to spread its influence. Back then, there was like a clear idea of good versus evil in the eyes of the American public, and to a lesser extent the British public, no offense. And so, in today's society where our villains are not as clear-cut, it really does beg the question if the Bond series is relevant to today's society, and I really like how the film explored that. And it also just takes the story to a whole nother level. It's not just a simple case of a spy trying to stop what is essentially a cartoony supervillain, but really a case of like the kind of toll that line of work can really take on someone, especially with the villain who's played by Javier Bardem in this film. That character is a clear-cut example of like how messed up that line of work can make you. I really liked Javier Bardem's performance, speaking of which, especially how he kind of made the character a little, if you know what I mean. I'm not the only one who thought that. People were giggling in the theater during the scene he was first introduced, and so they were all thinking the same exact thing. From a technical standpoint, you can definitely tell it's a nice blend of old and new. It does have a lot of the same more classic style of cinematography where the camera is locked down and it keeps things pretty atmospheric, which a lot of films haven't been doing nowadays, mostly because a lot of them have a budget of a ham sandwich. Although it stayed to mostly a classic style of shooting, it did have some modern twists to it. And that's also the same case with the overall mise-en-scène and the visual aesthetic of the film, with how everything is set up. I mean, with the characters' costumes, they pull on some elements from older Bond films. You've got the Bond girls kind of looking like the Bond girls, but you also have the more modern aspects with certain characters actually looking like hired goons and hired mercenaries, and actually looking like soldiers rather than just faceless goons with really ridiculous looking jumpsuits or something. It takes a nice blend of old and new, but it takes the right parts from the old, where you have the kind of classy look of the character and the classy set design. You have the classy aura of the James Bond world with the nice modern edge to it that doesn't go too overboard. In the case of the writing, well, it's paced really well, especially with giving you enough breathing room between action scenes. I mean, most other modern action films try to put all their action back to back right next to one another because they think the audience will get bored, whereas this film, it gives you some breathing room. So you have like the action in the first scene, then you got some breathing room, more mild action here, a little more breathing room, and it just slowly ramps it up until it builds it up to the actual exciting climax of the film. I really like the dialogue in this film because it has that nice degree of wit. I mean, you get some of the occasional like Bondish one-liners, as well as subtle references and nods here and there to other films. And it's just overall, it just has one of those elements to it where it has some nice little lines that you get a nice little chuckle out of, but it doesn't completely derail the tone of the film. It's just kind of something mild that sounds like an actual conversation between two people. So overall, I found this film to be really enjoyable. I mean, first thing I have to say is that this film feels more like an actual reboot than the previous two films. I mean, the previous two films were kind of supposed to be the grittier, edgier reboot, whereas this one feels like more of a reboot of the classic Bond franchise, where it's saying, hey, we're going back to the same classic Bond style, we're just establishing the new status quo. It's shot really well, it's edited really well, it's written really well, it's put together in a nice, enjoyable package. It's a bit on the long side, but it doesn't really drag, and so the length doesn't really detract from the overall experience. It's just one of those cases where you go into the theater, then you come out and you realize that 2.5 hours have passed. So on my personal scale, I'm giving Skyfall a 5 out of 5. A lot of people have probably been giving it the same ranking. Some people may be a little more critical, but overall, it's an enjoyable film and definitely a must-see if you're a fan of James Bond. And if you're not too familiar with James Bond, you'll still enjoy it nonetheless. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. Now, I know I promised 2 reviews this week, but the screening of Lincoln I went to, well, the problem is that it had films kind of the projector glitched out, the copy wasn't working, so they had to reschedule it for next week. So next week, we'll be getting my review of Lincoln. See you then.